He took the action in response to what he described as aggressive and unfriendly actions by NATO and Western countries. Here he is speaking earlier.
I ordered the defense minister and the chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces to put the deterrence forces of the Russian army into a special mode of combat service.
Well, for more, we can now speak to Melinda Herring, who is Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme tonight. I'd like to start by asking, how likely are we to see the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine?
Thanks for having me. Well, we don't know. So most analysts think that Vladimir Putin has changed. The Vladimir Putin that we know and have studied since 1999 he would take risks, but they were small and calculated. And he's behaving in a new way, and it's very hard to predict his behavior. It looked like his team is very uncomfortable with the decision to put Russia on high alert. Hopefully this is just bluff. He's just bluffing. But at this point, I would say it's anyone's guess, 50-50, if you want me to give you a number.
As you were saying, it does seem like a different person to the person that we've been studying since the 90s. What do you think has changed in Vladimir Putin?
That's a great question. So last week when we saw Macron, or the week before, he wanted to talk about Russia's historic grievances. Now, this is not new for Putin. If you followed Putin for any amount of time, you know that this is one of his favorite themes. But he continued to harp on it, and Macron would come back and say, hey, let's talk about an exit ramp. Hey, let's talk about Minsk. Let's talk about a peace, a possible peace accord. And he went right back to how the West has undermined him and how NATO is the problem. He went back to those talking points. I think he actually believes them this time. He's also getting older, and we know that he's thinking about his place in Russian history. So he wants to go down in the Russian history books as a great Russian leader. And when he talks about greatness, he talks about Stalin and Ivan the Great. And they were great because they took big swaths of Russian land. So I think that's part of it. It's partly ego, but it's also partly timing. He's looked at the world, and there's weakness everywhere. And this is his great moment to snap up Ukraine.
Right, but ironically, what he has achieved is more European unity, more dependence on NATO. We've seen European Union members and their allies impose a no-fly zone, cutting Russian banks off from SWIFT, supplying weapons now to Ukraine, this unprecedented step by the bloc earlier today. Do you think these measures will be enough to deter further escalation? Because at the moment, it seems like they seem to have made Putin even angrier.
Well, that's the problem. So he is still in control. Kiev is still under assault, right? And it seems very clear, as President Zelensky has said, that they want to kill me, that they want me out, and they want to install someone else. Look, the EU has done miraculous work. Biden's team has done very good work. There's a lot of good stuff that's being done, but this is still a very hot war, and I would not start getting too optimistic at this point. The Russian forces probably have not unleashed. They've been very careful so far. They haven't hit a lot of civilian targets, thank God, and they really haven't turned up the heat. It's going to get a lot worse, I hate to say.
So what do you make of the Ukrainian resistance effort so far? Do you think they'll be strong enough to resist a further push by Putin's forces?
So Ukrainians of all ages are coming out, and they're joining the resistance, and that's fantastic. You'll see pictures of all sorts of people running around Ukraine with AK-47s. A lot of these people don't have any military training. So, it's like giving me a gun. I'm an analyst. I should be reading books and writing articles. My friends are lawyers. They shoot on the weekends, but they don't have the kind of training that you need to deal with one of the finest armies in the world. That being said, I'm really impressed with the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army has been fighting Russia since 2014. They're experienced. They know their terrain, and they're motivated. They know that this is an existential struggle and that they have to win, or their homeland will be wiped off the map and their children will die. So, hats off to the Ukrainian army. I think they're doing a hell of a job.
Where do you see this invasion heading? I mean, there are already talks about a potential Europe-wide refugee crisis, between 5 to maybe even 7 million people displaced across the continent. Is this a real possibility?
Yes, it is. It's already happening. I just came back from Warsaw, Poland, and Ukrainians are starting to pour in, and they're starting to set up refugee services there. And the crisis became more acute over the weekend. So 2 days ago, the wait at the border between Ukraine and Poland was about 9 hours. Now it's long. It's very, very long. And there's some reports that these countries were not ready, that they didn't set up the services they need, they didn't put toilets in place. Come on, Europe, get your act together. So I think this is definitely something to watch. I've heard up to 5 million. I haven't heard 5 to 7 million. If that number is accurate, that's really disturbing.
Well,
But yes,
I mean, we've had the UN predict 5 million, but the EU today has gone even further and said we might even have 7 million people displaced if the conflict spreads beyond Ukraine's borders. I mean, it's a terrifying thought.
that's absolutely possible. There's 41 million people in Ukraine. The problem, or I think it's important to say though, that Ukrainians want to live in Ukraine. They will go back to Ukraine as soon as it's peaceful. So yes, they need temporary refuge, and people can't get out now, right? There's people. I have a lot of friends who are trying to get out, and most of us thought that Lviv, the big city in Western Ukraine, was safe, but it's not safe. I think a lot of the community and Ukrainians themselves thought Western Ukraine would be free from bombing, and it hasn't been. So that's one of the things that surprises me the most of the last 4 days, is how expansive the bombing and the attacks have been.
And just very quickly, we've seen Germany change its decades-long defense policy in response to Russia's aggression. What other long-term impacts on Europe and European countries do you foresee as a result of this conflict?
So NATO now has great unity, and it has purpose. It was sort of a moribund organization. It wasn't sure what it was doing after Afghanistan, and it has real purpose and real ambition now. I think we're going to see 2 countries join the NATO alliance. I think that will happen quite soon. I think that you're right, that Germany changing its tune is huge. We're going to see greater defense spending from the big European countries. And I think that there's going to be changes in the law, especially in England, on oligarchs. I think there's going to be greater transparency. And I think a lot of Western governments are going to be less willing to put up with dirty Russian money and dirty money in general as a result of this conflict.
Okay, Melinda Herring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, thank you very much for speaking to us. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Well, Ukrainian forces have resisted a Russian invasion for 4 days now. New satellite images taken this Sunday, though, show more Russian ground forces getting closer to the capital, Kiev. The pictures from private US security company, or US imaging company rather, Maxar, show a deployment comprised of hundreds of military vehicles extending more than 5 kilometers. Ukraine says Kiev and its second largest city, Kharkiv, remain under Ukrainian control. France 24's Rob Parsons reports from the capital.
As you know, we can't go out on the streets at the moment because of the curfew. We've been told that if we do go out in the streets and we're spotted by Ukrainian defense forces, they'll treat us as a part of a sabotage unit and open fire on us. Therefore, we are now in the cellar of the place where we're staying, and we've come down here because news has just come to the defense ministry here that 2 Iskander rockets have been launched from Belarus in the direction of Kiev, although I've heard that one of them has been brought down north of the capital city. But this is a sort of a routine occurrence now. Whenever the defense ministry gets information that something is coming this way, either a siren goes off or inside the hotel a warning is announced and everybody gets down into the cellar as quick as they possibly can. The atmosphere is surprisingly or astonishingly resilient, I would say, wherever you go in Kiev or outside Kiev throughout the country. Defense units are being formed, and there seems to be a sort of consolidation of the national spirit with everybody, young and old, getting ready to either fight or support the defenders of Ukraine against this Russian invasion. Many of people who have served in territorial defense units in the past have got some sort of military experience, but loads of them are signing up or digging trenches, cooking food for soldiers. And as you pointed out, just over the last 24 hours, a Russian incursion into Ukraine's second biggest city, Kharkiv, was repulsed by the Ukrainians at considerable loss to the Russian armed forces. There were tanks and armored vehicles strewn all over the streets of Kharkiv, and dozens of Russian soldiers have been surrendering to the Ukrainian armed forces. Many of them saying, incidentally, that they thought they were in Ukraine because it was part of a training exercise. Some of them even suggesting that they weren't even aware that they were in Ukraine.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the number of Ukrainians who have fled to neighbouring countries has surpassed 400,000, according to the UN Refugee Agency. Most of them have entered Poland and